The second option that we want to put on the table, we call escalate to de-escalate. This is an idea that comes up actually quite a lot in policy discussions, and I think there are good reasons to be wary of it, which we'll get to. But the theory is that the willingness to go further on your side either achieves some sort of limited objective that makes it easier to stop or changes the calculus on the other side of the conflict. They see that you're willing to go further, so they are more incentivized to end the war, to back down, to make concessions. And that actually escalating can lead to a more rapid end to the war than our option one, which is just declaring victory and stopping. One version of this could be the idea that we debated last week, going in and seizing the highly enriched uranium, about 1,000 pounds of it that remains, we believe, although we don't know for sure, in the tunnels underneath the Esfahan nuclear facility, and that could be rapidly enriched further into weapons-grade material if Iran chooses to go down that path and ultimately lead to a bomb. So the U.S. could decide that one way to end this conflict faster is to embark on this high-risk operation, grab the highly enriched uranium, and then use that as a pretext to actually end the war. Now we've accomplished everything that we intended to accomplish. Another version, though, of escalate to de-escalate is what we saw play out yesterday,
Absolutely.
which shows, I think, the folly and the danger associated with this option if you haven't fully thought through how the other side could respond. So I think the theory of the case, and we know this to some extent because, as with everything in this administration, the internal discussions end up in public before not too long, that the United States and Israel taking the strikes, but the United States approving of them, believed that escalating attacks on Iran's energy infrastructure, in this case, South Pars gas field that we talked about with Halima, would lead Iran to think, okay, now the consequences are so severe that we have to look to de-escalate ourselves. And in fact, Iran made exactly the opposite calculus. Iran decided to essentially mirror image the U.S. Authorized Israeli attacks and go after energy infrastructure in the Gulf. So instead of escalate to de-escalate, we ended up getting escalate to escalate. And that made the United States uncomfortable quite clearly, because then you had the president of the United States come out and say, actually, I was never for these Israeli strikes on energy infrastructure, which I think we know is probably not the case based on the reporting that had already been in the public record, and that it should stop. Both Israel should stop attacking Iranian energy infrastructure, and Iran should stop attacking infrastructure in the Gulf in response. And I think the likelihood that Iran is going to listen to that, given that they had their facilities hit first, is uncertain at best going forward. So that episode, which also created, by the way, a significant rift between the United States and Israel, because then you had Israeli officials coming out and essentially contradicting President Trump. Oh, no, no, we ran those strikes by the United States, and they were just fine with them, including the president, Israeli officials said on background. So the result of this escalate to de-escalate strategy was Iranian escalation and a split between the United States and Israel, which have tried to maintain sort of strategic alignment in the course of this conflict. There are other risks associated with escalate to de-escalate. If you try a high-risk operation, as we've discussed, like seizing the highly enriched uranium, it could go wrong. And say a number of American or Israeli forces are killed, or say you go in and you look for the highly enriched uranium and it's not there, and you've just launched this very high-profile, high-risk operation and accomplish nothing from it. Well, what do you do at that point? Then do you just stop? Then do you have to escalate again? It creates a lot of these strategic dilemmas that there are not easy answers to. So I worry about this policy option every time it comes up in the Situation Room, which it does often. I remember going back to the Syria conflict, the theory that was articulated for why the United States should do more militarily to try to dislodge President Assad, back 10, 12 years ago, was if we escalated more, it might be a quicker off-ramp to him deciding, all right, I don't want to be president of Syria anymore. I'd like to just transition away to a more democratic leadership. And the arguments that were made on the other side were the ones that I just laid out that are disadvantageous in the current moment. So escalate to de-escalate is intellectually appealing. I think in reality, it can be highly complicated. We saw that yesterday.
I would just add one point. I think that's all extremely well put. And you're right that this is this kind of trope that comes up constantly in the Situation Room. Let's just escalate to de-escalate. And the additional point I want to put on the table is that when you're on this kind of escalation ladder, where both sides are testing and probing the other side's willingness to go further up that ladder. Um, you really have to think hard about putting yourself in the other person's shoes and what they perceive your appetite for escalation really is. And in this case, if you're sitting in Tehran and what you've seen in the last 24 hours is the president of the United States seeming to authorize a strike against your gas facility, but as soon as you hit back, he disowns that strike and then says,
Yeah.
we won't do any more of that. And then says, we're actually going to unsanction Iranian oil. The literal opposite of maximum pressure, which was the big kind of Trump tagline for sanctions on Iranian oil in the first term. You're probably sitting there thinking, this guy's reasonably sensitive to energy markets, and he doesn't really mean it that he's going to keep going up the ladder. And so an escalate to de-escalate strategy is particularly dangerous if the other side simply doesn't think you're credible. And I think right now that's the reality, is that the Iranians don't think President Trump is credible. They're prepared to go tit for tat. They're prepared to call, and President Trump is not prepared to re-raise, but in fact appears to be, at least in this instance, folding. So that creates an especially dangerous dynamic for escalate to de-escalate.